What happens when spears meet rifles? When empire meets defiance? When a people decide they'd rather die than kneel? It was the age of conquest. The British Empire marched with red coats, cold steel, and colonial arrogance. But in the rolling hills of southern Africa, they would meet something they never expected. Discipline, strategy, and an enemy that didn't fear death. This is the true story of how the mighty British Army walked into a trap, and how the Zulu warriors wrote their name in blood and thunder. This is Isandlwana. The sun rose slowly over the rugged hills of KwaZulu-Natal. Mist clung to the earth like a warning, and in the distance, the silhouette of Isandlwana mountain stood jagged and still, like the horn of a beast waiting to strike. The year was 1879. The British Empire, expanding aggressively into southern Africa, had just delivered an ultimatum to the Zulu King Cetshwayo. The demand? Submit to British authority, disband your army, and allow missionaries and colonial law to rule your land. Cetshwayo's answer was silent, but the silence was war. On January 11th, 1879, British forces under Lord Chelmsford crossed into Zululand with nearly 18,000 men, divided into several columns. Their mission was to invade, break Zulu resistance, and force total submission. The invaders had modern rifles, artillery, and the confidence of imperial arrogance. One of these British columns, about 1,700 soldiers and hundreds of camp followers, set up camp at the base of Isandlwana Hill. They felt safe. They didn't dig trenches. They didn't build defenses. They believed the Zulus wouldn't dare attack them in the open. They were wrong. Meanwhile, in the valleys and hills beyond, over 20,000 Zulu warriors, led by Ncingwayo Kamaholekoza and Mavumengwana, lay hidden. They moved silently through ravines, behind hills, and in tall grass. The Zulu army was no band of savages. They were trained in tactics, discipline, and silent coordination. Their formation was legendary. The horns of the buffalo, a strategy where the flanks, horns, would encircle, the center, chest, would engage, and reserves, loins, would strike the final blow. The British didn't see them coming. On the morning of January 22nd, Lord Chelmsford took half the British force and marched east to scout for Zulus, believing the main threat lay further away. This decision would be fatal. Back at the camp, Colonel Pauline remained in charge, relaxed but alert. Scouts reported Zulu movements nearby, but they were dismissed as minor threats. Suddenly, a scout galloped into camp, pale and trembling. "Thousands, sir, in the hills, waiting." But by then, it was already too late. At around 11 a.m., the hills began to move. It was not mist. It was Zulu warriors, row upon row, shield to shield, spear in hand, charging. And as the British scrambled in confusion and disbelief, Isandlwana awakened. The first bullets cracked the silence like thunder. The British soldiers, startled, scrambled into lines, rifles raised. A dust storm danced over the ridge, not from wind, but from feet. Thousands of them. They came in waves. Zulu warriors surged down the hills like a living ocean, wave after wave, undeterred by bullets, screaming their war cries. Men with spears and cowhide shields, closing the distance at a terrifying pace. Colonel Pauline shouted commands, officers yelled for calm, red-coated lines formed across the plain, muskets rattling to life. Their rifles began cutting down the first wave, but for every Zulu that fell, 3 more replaced him. The Zulu army moved like a machine. Their famous tactic, imperial, was now alive in motion. The chest of the buffalo struck the front line, pinning the British down. The horns swung wide through the hills, flanking both sides, and the loins, hidden behind the main force, waited to pounce when the British grew tired. It was a trap. A perfect, horrifying trap. For a while the British lines held. Rifles fired in rhythm, bodies dropped. The ground became slick with blood and ash. But the Zulus, they did not break. One Zulu warrior dropped to his knees and hurled his spear straight into a British sergeant's throat before being cut down. Another crawled low through the grass, dodging bullets, and stabbed a man through the leg before the bayonet pierced his chest. The British began to run low on ammunition. Their supply wagons were too far behind. The native porters carrying bullets had already fled. And still the Zulus came. A young drummer boy, no more than 16, was seen trying to reload his rifle behind a wagon when a shadow fell over him. He turned. A spear caught him in the chest. He didn't even scream. Officers yelled, men fired blindly. Some dropped their weapons and fled. A British private turned to run and was caught mid-sprint by a Zulu blade that split his back like firewood. Another tried to mount a horse, only for both rider and beast to be dragged down by a wall of shields and spears. This wasn't a skirmish anymore. This was slaughter. Colonel Durnford, the man Chelmsford had placed nearby for cavalry support, arrived to reinforce the British left flank. But even with fresh troops, it wasn't enough. The horns had curled around. Now the British were surrounded. The hill of Isandlwana cast a long shadow across the dying men as screams and smoke filled the air. There was no escape, no reinforcements, no mercy. By mid-afternoon, the firing slowed. Bayonets gave way to blades, and the battlefield was painted with the last breaths of an empire that thought itself untouchable. By 1:30 p.m., the British position had completely unraveled. The firing had slowed. Smoke hung low over the plain, choking the air, mixing with the metallic stench of blood. The sun, once high and proud, now beat down mercilessly on the chaos below. Men were no longer fighting for empire. They were fighting for breath. Colonel Pauline's defensive line had collapsed under the sheer weight of Zulu numbers. Despite their outdated weapons and lack of body armor, the Zulu warriors had one thing that mattered more in that moment: numbers and fearlessness. The British rifles had done their damage, but they were never designed for this. Not for wave after wave of hand-to-hand combat. Not against warriors who would charge into gunfire if it meant piercing a redcoat once. Here and there, small groups of British soldiers tried to hold the line, behind wagons, on slight rises in the terrain. Some formed tight circles, shoulder to shoulder, stabbing with bayonets and reloading as fast as shaking hands would allow. They knew the Zulus weren't taking prisoners. It was not organized. It was not noble. It was survival, brutal, cornered survival. A British officer stood atop a supply box, shouting orders no one could hear. Moments later he was gone, swallowed in a rush of Zulu shields. Another group made a run for the Buffalo River, hoping to cross to safety. The Zulus pursued them without hesitation. Those who didn't drown were cut down on the banks. The Zulu didn't kill for cruelty. They killed because war had come to their land, and in their world, war was not a place for pity. War was not a place for mercy. As the encirclement tightened, about 400 men, what was left of the main British force, gathered near the saddle, the lower ridge connecting Isandlwana to another hill. It was their last defensible point. The men here were exhausted, bloodied, out of ammo and surrounded. They fixed bayonets. They didn't expect to survive. At around 3 p.m., the Zulu loins, the reserves, moved in. Fresh warriors with full energy crashed into the final British stand. What followed wasn't a battle, it was an execution. According to Zulu witnesses, the British at the saddle fought with terrifying determination. Some men used their rifles as clubs. Others screamed curses into the faces of their killers. They died standing. Only a handful of men would escape on horseback. And when the killing stopped, silence returned. The mountain stood unchanged. The wind moved through the tall grass as if nothing had happened. The smoke had cleared. The vultures had begun to circle. But scattered across the field, over 1,300 British soldiers lay dead, many stripped and ritually disemboweled by Zulu tradition. But it was not victory without pain. The Zulu impi lost an estimated 1,000 warriors. Some regiments were decimated. Others walked wounded or never returned. They mourned their dead that night. They had won, but they had also bled. And they knew the British would return. The victory was not just military. It was spiritual. It was political. It was personal. When news of Isandlwana reached Britain, it sent shockwaves through the empire. The press couldn't believe it. An indigenous African army, armed mostly with spears and shields, had annihilated a professional European force. British pride was shaken. Questions were asked, and answers were demanded. Back in Natal, survivors trickled in, haunted and broken. Lord Chelmsford, who had left the camp earlier that day, returned to find a nightmare. Bodies everywhere, supplies gone, men mutilated. He was stunned, but not humbled. Within weeks, the British war machine responded. Reinforcements poured into southern Africa. Artillery, Gatling guns, cavalry. No more arrogance, no more underestimation. Their mission was now revenge and conquest. Isandlwana remains one of the greatest African military victories in history. It shattered the myth of European invincibility. It showed that African strategy, discipline, and courage could rival and overcome colonial arrogance. But it came at a cost. Still, even today, when warriors speak of resistance, when children learn of courage, when Africa remembers her heroes, Isandlwana is never forgotten. They came with rifles. The Zulu answered with spears. They came with empire. The Zulu answered with unity. And at Isandlwana, they did not kneel. If this story moved you, taught you, or gave you chills, do me one thing. Like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on your notification bell so you never miss the stories they don't teach in school. This was the Battle of Isandlwana, told by tales of the ancestors. And trust me, more legends are coming. Stay tuned for part 2, the Battle of Ulundi, where the British come back for their revenge. Till then, stay safe.